My grandson called me at 3:17 in the morning, and I knew before I even picked up the phone that something was terribly wrong. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice so thin and fractured I barely recognized it. "I'm at Houston Methodist. They brought me here in an ambulance." "But Grandpa, I didn't call the ambulance. Derek called it. He told them I tried to hurt myself. And Mom is standing right there next to him and she won't even look at me. Please come. Please hurry. I'm scared." I was out of bed before the last word left his mouth. If you are a grandparent listening to this right now, you already know that particular kind of terror. The kind that starts in your chest and spreads outward until your hands are moving on their own, pulling on your coat, grabbing your keys, your body already headed for the door before your mind has fully caught up. My name is Robert Callahan. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a police officer in the city of Houston, the last 12 of those as chief of police. I have walked into burning buildings. I have talked men off ledges. I have sat at bedsides and delivered the worst news a human being can receive. Nothing, in all of those 31 years, prepared me for the night my grandson called me from a hospital room because his own stepfather had put him there. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. And if you have ever had to stand up for a child when the adults around them failed completely, hit that like button. This story is for you. My daughter, Caroline, lost her first husband, my son-in-law Patrick, to pancreatic cancer 5 years ago. Patrick was a good man, a quiet man, a contractor who built custom homes in the hill country and coached youth baseball on weekends, and never once raised his voice at my grandson Connor in 14 years of raising him. When Patrick died, it broke something in Caroline that I am not sure ever fully healed. She grieved hard and she grieved alone, and I watched from a careful distance because she is a grown woman, and I have always believed in letting my children find their own footing, even when it hurts me to watch them stumble. Derek Morse entered her life 18 months after Patrick's funeral. He was a financial advisor with a downtown office and a leased BMW and a handshake that went on about 3 seconds too long. From the very first dinner I had with him, something in my gut moved in the wrong direction. I ignored it. I told myself I was being a protective old man, that no one was ever going to be good enough for my daughter in my eyes, that I owed it to Caroline to keep my mouth shut and give this person a fair chance. I wish I had trusted my instincts. I have spent 40 years of my life teaching young officers to trust their instincts, and then I went home and failed to follow my own advice. They married 14 months after they met. Connor was 15 by then, quiet and watchful in the way boys become when they are processing something they do not yet have the words for. He was a good student, a runner. He spent his weekends listening to music and drawing in notebooks he kept stacked on his desk. He was not a troubled kid. He was not a difficult kid. He was a grieving kid who missed his father and was trying to figure out where he fit in a house that suddenly had a stranger sleeping in the room down the hall. The drive to Houston Methodist took me 22 minutes. I pushed every light I legally could and a few I probably could not justify. When I walked through the emergency entrance, the charge nurse at the front desk looked up, recognized me immediately, and came around the counter before I had taken 3 full steps into the lobby. "Chief Callahan," she said, and then she stopped, clearly uncertain what to say next. I had not been chief for 2 years, but in a city like Houston, the title tends to stick. I told her I was there for my grandson, Connor Whitfield, and I needed to see him immediately. She led me down the corridor without another word. I found Connor in a curtained bay near the end of the hall. He was sitting upright on the narrow hospital bed, still wearing his pajamas, a thin paper bracelet around his left wrist. His right eye was partially swollen. There was a bruise along his jaw that had not been there the last time I had seen him, 10 days earlier, when he had come to my house for dinner and eaten 2 plates of my chili and laughed at a story I told about a rookie officer I once supervised. When he saw me come through the curtain, he pressed his lips together hard, the way teenage boys do when they are trying not to cry in front of someone they respect. I crossed the room in 4 steps and put my arms around him and held him the way I had not held him since the day of his father's funeral. He gripped the back of my jacket with both hands and his whole body shook. "I'm not crazy, Grandpa," he said into my shoulder. "I didn't do anything to myself. I promise you I didn't." "I know that," I told him. "I know. Now take a breath and tell me what happened." He pulled back and wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the curtain behind me like he was checking that no one was listening. "Derek and Mom are in the family waiting room," he said. "They told the intake doctor that I've been self-harming for months. That I have severe depression and I've been refusing to get treatment. They brought a folder, Grandpa. An actual folder with papers in it. I don't know what's in it, but they gave it to the doctor when they checked me in. I asked him what actually happened tonight. He took a slow breath. I heard them arguing, he said. Derek and Mom. Late, around midnight. I couldn't hear the words, but Derek was loud the way he gets loud. And I heard Mom crying. And then it went quiet. Too quiet. I got up to check on her, just to make sure she was okay. And when I came out of my room, Derek was standing in the hallway. He had his phone out, and he was already on a call. He looked right at me and said, "Yes, we need an ambulance immediately. I think my stepson is in crisis." And then he grabbed my arm and I pulled back, and he grabbed harder, and that's when I hit the wall and my face got like this. He pointed to his jaw. Mom came out of the bedroom and just stood there, Grandpa. She just stood there. I thanked him. I told him to sit tight, that I was going to speak with the doctor, and that under no circumstances was he to sign anything or speak with anyone until I came back. He nodded. Then he grabbed my arm before I stepped out. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "there's something else. Something I've been trying to tell Mom for a while, but every time I try, Derek finds out, and then things get worse at home. Dad's life insurance. The settlement. Derek's been asking Mom about it a lot, about how it's set up, who controls it, when Connor can access it. I've heard them more than once. I let the curtain fall closed behind me and stood in the corridor for a moment. 31 years of law enforcement had given me the ability to hold a great deal of information in a very organized mental structure even when every nerve in my body was on fire. I began doing that now. I walked to the nurse's station and asked to speak with the attending physician. The doctor was a young woman, no more than 35, with tired eyes and the particular guarded expression of someone who has learned to navigate complicated family situations without taking sides. She told me Connor had been brought in by family members reporting a self-harm episode. She had not yet conducted a full psychological evaluation. The intake paperwork submitted by the stepfather included what appeared to be a printed log of incidents over several months, behavioral observations, and a referral letter from a doctor, Marcus Webb, a licensed psychiatrist, recommending immediate inpatient evaluation. I asked to see the referral letter. She hesitated. I told her, quietly and without raising my voice, that I was Connor's maternal grandfather and his emergency contact, that the boy's father was deceased, and that I intended to act as his legal advocate for the duration of this visit. I also told her that in my experience, which I briefly summarized, a document produced by a family member at midnight describing months of behavioral decline in a child who presented no such symptoms to any teacher, coach, or other family member, was the kind of document that deserved careful scrutiny before it shaped a medical decision. She studied me for a long moment. Then, she handed me the referral letter. I read it standing at the nurse's station. Dr. Marcus Webb, board certified. Practice address listed as a medical plaza in Sugar Land. The letter described Connor in clinical language I recognized as technically accurate but emotionally hollow, the way a document reads when it has been constructed to reach a predetermined conclusion. It referenced self-isolating behavior, erratic emotional responses, an incident in October involving property damage, and a persistent refusal to engage with family support structures. It recommended a minimum 14-day inpatient psychiatric evaluation at a residential facility in Katy called Clearview Adolescent Recovery Center. I folded the letter and placed it carefully in the inner pocket of my coat. Then I went to the family waiting room. Derek Morse was seated in the far corner with his arms crossed and his legs stretched out in front of him, projecting the particular physical ease of a man who believes he has already won. Caroline was beside him, smaller than I remembered, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not look up when I came in. That was the moment I understood how serious this was. My daughter has always looked up when I enter a room. It is simply what she does. The fact that she did not told me she had been managed into a position she was too ashamed or too frightened to defend. "Robert," Derek said, standing and extending his hand with that same 3-second handshake. "I'm glad you're here. This has been an incredibly difficult night, and I know Caroline needs her father's support right now." I did not take his hand. I looked at my daughter. "Caroline," I said, "how did Connor's face get like that?" She flinched. Derek answered before she could speak. "The boy was agitated," he said. "He came out of his room in a state, and there was a physical altercation in the hallway. It happens with kids in crisis. The important thing now is getting him proper care before this escalates further. I looked at him for a long moment without speaking. I have used silence as a professional instrument for 3 decades. Derek Morse was not comfortable with silence. He filled it immediately, explaining the folder he had prepared, referencing the psychiatrist, mentioning the facility in Katy as though he had researched it extensively, which he had. He talked for nearly 2 full minutes without stopping. When he finished, I asked a single question. "How long have you known Marcus Webb?" He blinked. "We were referred to him by," he began. I asked the question again. "How long have you personally known Marcus Webb?" He shifted his weight. "A few months. He comes highly recommended by a colleague." I nodded once, said nothing further, and walked back out of the waiting room. I stepped outside into the warm Houston night and called a man named Leonard Cruz. Leonard had been my deputy chief for 6 years, a former homicide detective, and the kind of man who answers his phone at 4 in the morning without complaint. I told him what I had. He told me to give him 90 minutes. I went back inside and sat with Connor. We did not talk much. I brought him water from the hall and turned on a low-volume baseball game on the wall-mounted TV and let him rest while I read the referral letter 3 more times and made notes on my phone. Leonard called back in 70 minutes. Marcus Webb, he said, had surrendered his DEA registration 4 years ago under circumstances that had been quietly settled out of court. He currently operated a small private practice and maintained a consulting relationship with 3 residential psychiatric facilities in the greater Houston area, including Clearview Adolescent Recovery Center. His consulting fees from Clearview in the prior fiscal year were a matter of public record, available in the facility's nonprofit filing, $47,000. I asked Leonard what he could find out about Clearview's ownership structure. He said, "Give him until morning." I next called my attorney, a woman named Sandra Park, who had handled my personal affairs for 15 years and had the temperament of someone who genuinely enjoys being woken up before dawn with a complicated problem. I described the situation. I told her about the referral letter, the proposed 14-day commitment, the facility, the financial advisor's stepfather, and Patrick's life insurance. She told me she needed 2 hours. She also told me not to let Connor sign a single piece of paper. The sun was coming up over the hospital parking structure when Sandra called back. She spoke for 12 minutes straight. I stood at the window of the corridor and listened and did not interrupt. Patrick's life insurance policy had paid out $800,000 at the time of his death. Under the terms of his estate, $300,000 of that had been placed in a custodial account designated for Connor, accessible in full at age 21, with a partial early release provision, available at 18 for documented educational expenses. Caroline controlled the account as custodian until Connor reached majority. As Connor's stepfather, Derek had no legal access to those funds. However, Sandra explained, if Connor were to be formally adjudicated as a minor, requiring long-term psychiatric institutionalization, the court could appoint a legal guardian to oversee his financial interests during his incapacity. In that scenario, as Connor's step-parent and the spouse of his legal custodian, Derek could petition to serve in that role. $300,000. A 14-day evaluation that, if it produced the right documentation from a well-compensated psychiatrist with a financial interest in the facility, could become something much longer. A boy in a locked ward who could not tell anyone what he knew about the conversations he had overheard in the hallway at midnight. A mother who had been isolated and frightened into standing still. I stood there at the window looking at the pale orange edge of the Houston skyline, and I felt the pieces settle into place with the cold, sickening clarity of a case coming into focus. This was not a man who had lost patience with a difficult stepson. This was a plan. I asked Sandra what I needed. She said I needed to get Connor out of that hospital today under my temporary guardianship, file an emergency protective order, and pull every financial record Derek Morse had touched since the day he married my daughter. She also said I needed something on Marcus Webb and the Clearview facility that made their relationship undeniable before Derek had time to distance himself from it. I knew exactly who to call. James Okafor had spent 22 years as a forensic financial investigator for the FBI field office in Houston before retiring 3 years ago to run a private firm. He owed me nothing, but we had worked enough cases together that we understood each other completely. I called him at 7 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I had. He said he would call me back by noon. By 9 that morning, Sandra had filed the emergency temporary guardianship petition, and I had been formally designated Connor's legal advocate for the immediate term. The attending physician, having reviewed Sandra's documentation and the questions I had raised about the web referral letter, agreed to defer the inpatient recommendation pending an independent psychiatric evaluation from a physician with no financial relationship to any residential facility. Derek and Caroline were notified by hospital administration. I was in the corridor when Derek received the news. The composure cracked, just for a moment, and what came through was not grief or confusion. It was calculation. He was running numbers behind his eyes. I took Connor home with me that morning. He slept for 4 hours on my couch with the television on low, and when he woke up, I made him eggs and toast, and we sat at my kitchen table, and I told him, in plain terms, what I believed was happening and what I was going to do about it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I knew something was wrong, Grandpa. I just didn't think anyone would believe me. I'm a teenager and he's a financial advisor who wears nice suits and remembers everyone's name." I told him the people who remember everyone's name are often the people most worth watching. James Okafor called at 11:47. He spoke for 20 minutes and I took 4 pages of notes. Derek Morse had opened 3 joint accounts with Caroline in the 18 months since their marriage. 2 were straightforward. The third was a savings vehicle classified as a family trust account, opened 6 months ago, that had received 3 transfers from Caroline's primary account, totaling $62,000. The stated purpose on the account documentation was long-term family financial planning. The named secondary beneficiary, in the event of both account holders' death or incapacity, was a limited liability company registered in Delaware. James had pulled the LLC registration. The sole member of that LLC was a name neither Caroline nor I had ever heard. But James had also run the digital footprint on Marcus Webb at my request. Webb's personal email, obtained through entirely legal discovery channels, showed 41 messages exchanged with Derek Morse over the prior 9 months. The earliest predated Connor's referral by 7 months. They were not the communications of a doctor and a concerned step-parent. They were the communications of 2 men coordinating a strategy. I now had the emails, the financial records, the LLC structure, the web consulting fees, and the hospital intake documents prepared by Derek. I had a 16-year-old boy with a bruised jaw who had been transported to an emergency room by ambulance at midnight, based on a claim he had not hurt himself. I had a mother who had been financially entangled and emotionally managed into silence. And I had 48 hours before Derek would begin to understand how much ground he was losing and start moving assets. I called Sandra. She called the Harris County District Attorney's office. I called Leonard Cruz. By 4 that afternoon, I had a meeting scheduled. I need to tell you about the moment I understood what Derek had done to my daughter. Not the financial piece, not the legal piece, but the human piece. It came at 7 that evening when Caroline appeared at my front door alone. She had driven herself. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn at the hospital, and she looked like a woman who had been awake for 36 hours and was only now beginning to thaw. I let her in. She sat down at my kitchen table, across from where Connor was eating soup, and she looked at her son's face for a long time. At the bruise along his jaw, at the paper bracelet still on his wrist that he hadn't taken off yet. She said, "I'm sorry, Connor." Her voice was barely audible. "I'm so sorry, I just stood there." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and went and put his arms around her, and she held on to him and wept in a way I had not seen her weep since Patrick's funeral. I stepped out of the kitchen and gave them the room. When she was composed, she sat back down and told me everything. The arguments about money she had not fully understood. The account Derek had encouraged her to open, explaining it in terminology she trusted because he was the professional. The way he had, over 18 months, reframed every conversation she'd had with her own son as evidence of instability, so that by the time he handed her the folder of documents on Connor, she had been prepared to believe them. He had not controlled her with anger. He had controlled her with expertise. He had made her feel, at every step, that he was the competent one, the informed one, the one who understood systems she did not. She had handed him her trust and her financial accounts and her judgment because he had spent 18 months carefully positioning himself as the person who deserved all 3. I thought about the 3-second handshake at our first dinner, the gut feeling I had ignored. If I had trusted it, I asked myself. If I had said something, but I had told myself I was being a protective old man, and I had kept my mouth shut. I was not going to make that mistake again. The meeting took place on Thursday morning in Sandra Park's conference room on the 22nd floor of a building in downtown Houston. Present were Sandra, Leonard Cruz, James Okafor, an investigator from the Harris County DA's office, and myself. We laid out the full structure of what Derek had built over 22 months. The financial entanglement, the manufactured documentation on Connor, the relationship with Webb, the LLC, the timed push toward institutionalization, coinciding with the point at which Connor would be approaching the partial release age for his custodial account. Sandra walked through the timeline with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years turning complex financial crimes into language a jury could follow. The investigator from the DA's office took notes without expression. At the end of the presentation, she closed her folder, looked at me, and said, "I think we have enough to open a formal investigation. If the email chain is as you describe, and the LLC beneficial ownership is what your investigator found, we are looking at fraud, financial elder abuse, and potentially felony child endangerment." I thanked her and told her I had one request. I wanted to be present when the conversation happened with Derek. Not the arrest, if it came to that, just the conversation. I had spent a career doing exactly this, walking into rooms and asking the questions that collapsed a story built on sand. I wanted to do it one more time. She considered it. Then she said yes. We arranged it for Friday afternoon under the pretext of a mediation meeting regarding the guardianship petition. Derek arrived with his own attorney, a man who was not yet aware of the full scope of what his client had done. Derek himself walked in with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who still believed he was managing the situation. He shook hands with people in the room. He nodded at me without quite meeting my eyes. Sandra opened the meeting with procedural language. Then she nodded to James Okafor. James opened his laptop and turned the screen toward the center of the table. What followed was the quietest 45 minutes I have ever spent in a professional setting. James walked through the financial records line by line. Sandra produced the printed email chain between Derek and Marcus Webb. The DA's investigator laid the Webb consulting fee documentation beside it. With each page that went onto the table, Derek's attorney leaned a little further back in his chair, and Derek himself became very still, in the way a person becomes still when they realize they are no longer managing anything. His attorney asked for a recess. Derek said nothing. When they returned from the hallway, the attorney informed us that his client wished to cooperate fully with the investigation. Derek Morse was formally charged 6 weeks later with financial fraud, filing a false report, and felony interference with child custody. He has since entered a guilty plea. Marcus Webb surrendered his medical license as part of a separate agreement with the Texas Medical Board. Clearview Adolescent Recovery Center is currently under investigation by the State Health Department. The joint accounts were frozen. The money Caroline had transferred was fully recovered. The LLC was dissolved. The custodial account, Connor's $300,000, remained exactly where Patrick had placed it, untouched. It is spring now. Houston is the kind of warm and green and loud with birds that makes it easy to forget how dark a winter can be. Caroline sold the house she had shared with Derek and moved into a rental near my neighborhood. She is in counseling twice a week with a therapist who specializes in coercive financial control, and she is, slowly and with great effort, learning to trust her own judgment again. She calls me every Sunday morning, which is something she did not do in the 2 years of her marriage to Derek, and we talk about ordinary things, Connor's running times, what she is reading, the garden she is starting on her back patio. Connor is 16 now. The bruise healed in 2 weeks. He placed third in his district's cross-country invitational in February, and I drove 40 minutes in rush-hour traffic to stand at the finish line and watch him come in. He is still drawing in his notebooks. He still eats 2 plates of chili when he comes to my house for dinner. He still laughs at my stories, even the ones he has heard before. Last month, he sat down beside me on my back porch after dinner and was quiet for a while, looking out at the yard. Then he said, "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." He said, "How did you know? When you got to the hospital that night, before you knew any of the financial stuff, how did you already know something was wrong?" I thought about it. I told him that 31 years of police work teaches you to read the gap between what someone says and what their body is doing at the same time. That Derek, when I walked into the waiting room, was sitting in a hospital at 4 in the morning because his stepson was in crisis, and he was relaxed. Not the kind of relax that comes from relief that help has arrived, the kind of relax that comes from having finished something you planned. Connor nodded slowly. he said. I kept waiting for someone to notice. I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder. That's the thing about the people who do this, I told him. They are very good at making the people around them feel like the problem belongs to the person with the least power. That is how they survive as long as they do. But they cannot hide everything forever. Eventually, there is always one moment, one detail, one phone call at 3 in the morning that starts pulling the whole thing apart. He looked at me. You're the phone call, he said. I thought about Patrick, who built homes with his hands and coached baseball on weekends and never once raised his voice. I thought about Caroline, learning to trust her own judgment again in a rental house near my neighborhood. I thought about the finish line in February and the way Connor looked when he crossed it. I am the phone call, I said, and I always will be. If there is a child in your life who is trying to tell you something and the adults around them keep explaining it away, please listen. Not to what the confident, well-dressed adult in the room is telling you, to the child, to the gap between what is being said and what the child's eyes are asking you to see. The most dangerous people in a family are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they are the ones who sound the most reasonable. Family is not always the people who share your roof. Sometimes it is the one person who picks up the phone at 3 a.m. and does not stop until you are safe. If this story mattered to you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or something you have carried for a long time, leave a comment below and tell me about it. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story from this channel. And to every grandfather, every grandmother, every aunt and uncle and older cousin who has ever stood between a child and something they could not yet name, thank you. What you do matters more than you will ever know.